You might think you already know the shape of history, the polished version wrapped in respectable words and framed with oil-painted portraits. But tonight, we are going to step into a quieter, dimmer corridor, one that the official records of the Russian Empire preferred to keep in shadow. The story begins not in the grand halls of St. Petersburg's palaces or in the gilded theaters where the Tsar's court gathered, but in the narrow, rain-dark streets just beyond the gaslight's reach. There were thousands of women here, living lives so far removed from the marble staircases of the Winter Palace that the empire itself barely acknowledged them except when it needed them. These women were part of an economy of the body, a network of survival and exploitation that existed openly yet invisibly, recorded in dusty police ledgers and whispered about in tea rooms, but never truly spoken of in daylight. And there is a reason for that, a reason bound up in shame, necessity, power, and the strange, half-forgotten laws that allowed this hidden world to flourish under the double-headed eagle's watchful gaze. If you stay with me, I'll take you through it gently, not as a moral lecture, but as a quiet walk through a side of history that prefers to be heard in the hush between midnight and dawn, when even the city's cobblestones seem to listen. The room around you is calm now. Maybe the curtains are drawn against the night, the air still, the faintest patter of rain tracing the glass. You can feel the softness beneath you, the way the blanket gathers warmth against your skin. This is a safe place to drift through difficult truths, one where history speaks in a slow, measured voice. Before we step deeper into the shadows of the Russian Empire, take a moment to breathe, to let your body sink a little further into where you are. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you'll know when the next quiet journey begins. Where are you listening from tonight? Is it a city whose streets hum even after midnight? Or somewhere rural, where the darkness outside is so complete it feels like another kind of ocean? Imagine for a moment that you are not in your own room, but in St. Petersburg on a winter's night in 1897. Snow falls in slow spirals under the weak amber glow of a street lamp, melting to slush where cartwheels have churned through earlier. The Neva River is locked under a crust of ice, and across its surface, the wind carries the faint chime of a distant bell. You walk past shopfronts shuttered against the cold, their windows dark, until you come upon a doorway lit by a single flickering lamp. A woman stands there in a wool shawl, her cheeks flushed not from warmth, but from the cold biting at her skin. She watches the street with an expression that is part invitation, part calculation, and part weariness, so deep it looks older than she is. This is one of hundreds, no, thousands of women who lived under what the empire called the regulated system, a bureaucracy that turned sex work into something documented, inspected, and policed. They were required to carry small yellow booklets, yellow tickets, issued by the police, which served both as an identification and a stigma. Once your name was entered into that ledger, it never truly left. The empire's theory was that regulation would control disease, preserve public morality, and prevent the spread of disorder. The reality was more complicated. For the women, the yellow ticket was a brand that marked them in every shop, every boarding house, every police station. Some had entered this life because of poverty so relentless it stripped away choice. Others had been tricked, trafficked from villages far from the capital with promises of domestic work that dissolved into something else the moment they arrived. Still others had fled homes where hunger and violence had become indistinguishable. The empire's laws claimed to offer them safety in exchange for their compliance weekly medical examinations, records kept in meticulous handwriting, but these systems often served the interests of those in power, not the women themselves. Picture the room where such an examination took place. A narrow space, walls washed in the cold color of lime, a single stove trying and failing to keep the air from freezing in your lungs. The doctor is brisk, disinterested, his pen scratching. Your name into the ledger, while you try not to meet his eyes. A paper smells faintly of ink and damp wool. When you leave, the street feels just as cold as before, but now it carries the weight of being seen only in one way. And yet, despite the machinery of control around them, these women formed their own network's quiet alliances that stretched from one lodging to another, whispered warnings about dangerous clients, pooled coins for a sick friend's medicine. In the brothels, behind curtains of faded velvet or patterned cloth, there were rules the empire didn't write down. You might share bread with another woman at the end of a long night. Your laughter, rising and short, bursts over a story about a client's absurd request. You might hide a letter from home under the thin mattress, reading it only when the world outside was too heavy to face. You might learn which policeman could be bribed to look the other way when you disappeared for a week to visit your mother. In the countryside, these moments didn't erase the darkness, but they shaped the texture of survival. The city itself seemed complicit in this double life by day. It was all processions and proclamations, the gold dome of St. Isaac's Cathedral gleaming in the pale sun. By night, it unfolded into a different map entirely, one drawn in whispers, and glances in the creak of staircases that led to unmarked rooms. As the snow deepens outside, you might find yourself wondering, how could a world so tightly controlled by imperial law still contain so much that slipped through its fingers? In the next part of our journey, we'll step inside one of those brothels, not as a customer, but as a witness, to see how the empire's official rules collided with the unwritten ones that truly governed the night. The door closes behind you, with a muted thud, muffling the distant sound of horses clattering over the icy street. And you are in a hallway lit by oil lamps that burn with a faint hiss. The air is warmer here, carrying the layered scent of coal smoke, cheap perfume, boiled cabbage from the kitchen downstairs, and the sharper tang of disinfectant that clings to the walls in a stubborn effort to mask the rest. This is not the gilded brothel of the popular imagination. The empire had those too, with crystal chandeliers, silk wallpapers, and discreet entrances for officers and merchants who could pay for such luxury. But this house is one of the countless mid-tier establishments scattered through the city, registered in the police books, and tolerated so long as its paperwork remained in order. The floorboards creak as a woman in a faded green dress passes by, her skirts brushing against the narrow walls. She carries a tray with 2 chipped teacups and a small plate of sugared prunes, her face painted with care, but revealing the fatigue. That comes from working in a place where nights bleed into mornings without clear boundaries. At the far end of the corridor, a door stands ajar, revealing a glimpse of a small parlor where a handful of women sit together, their bodies angled, toward a coal stove whose grate glows faintly red. One woman mends a tear in her stocking. Another writes a letter with painstaking slowness, stopping now and then to warm her ink-stiffened fingers. Their voices are low, but there is laughter too, and the occasional burst of a song that trails into nothing. These rooms are their workplace, but also their refuge from the street's gaze. Every brothel had its own rhythms. This one begins stirring in the late afternoon, when the daylight is already fading in winter. By 6 o'clock, the lamps are lit, dresses are pressed, hair is pinned, and the front room begins to fill with the slow arrival of clients. The madam, a stern woman with a braided bun and a ledger she guards more fiercely than her own sleep, keeps a careful watch on comings and goings. She knows the police inspectors by name and sometimes by appetite, for their visits are as much about exerting presence as about enforcing rules. Once a week, a doctor arrives to perform examinations, his bag smelling of antiseptic and old leather, his manner brisk and without kindness. The women submit because the alternative is to lose their yellow ticket, and with it, their legal right to work, which might sound like liberation, but would, in truth, push them into the far more dangerous world of the unregulated street. In these regulated houses, there is at least the illusion of protection, a set of rules that, though often bent or broken, still offer some structure. Yet the structure is built on the unspoken understanding that the women's bodies are a resource, to be managed, taxed, and when convenient, discarded. As you settle into the parlor's worn armchair, a small scene plays out before you. A man in a fur-collared coat leans close to a woman whose hair is the color of wet chestnuts, speaking in the low, practiced tone of someone who wants to appear charming without revealing too much. She nods occasionally, her eyes flicking toward the madam, measuring whether this client will be quick, generous, or troublesome. Another woman sits by the stove, darning a shirt cuff that is clearly not her own, humming a folk song from a province, hundreds of miles away. Many here are far from home, some from the Baltic coast, others from Ukraine or the rural heartlands where winters are longer, food scarcer, and choices fewer. They send money back when they can, though often the flow is interrupted by illness, by debt, or by the madam's cut of their earnings, which could be as high as half. The empire's regulations required that brothels be licensed and that their residents be registered, but they did little to address the conditions inside. Bedrooms here are small, the wallpaper faded and sometimes peeling to reveal earlier layers. From decades past, a narrow bed, a wash basin, a small mirror, these are the tools of the trade as much as the rouge in a tin or the comb on the dresser. Some women personalize their rooms with a postcard of a cathedral, a pressed flower between glass, or a small icon tucked discreetly above the bed's headboard. Others keep them bare, as if to avoid forming any attachment to a space they might leave without notice. The work itself is a mixture of ritual and unpredictability. A client might be kind, even tender in a way that surprises, or he might be impatient, rough, and uninterested in anything beyond transaction. The women learn to read them quickly, to steer the evening toward safety, and, when possible, toward a better payment. There is an art to this that is rarely spoken of outside these walls. How to keep a conversation just long enough to make the client feel seen. How to suggest another drink that will add to the house's tally. How to coax a small gift that can be traded later for coal or bread. Yet beyond the craft and the survival strategies lies the simple, enduring reality of fatigue. Bodies tire, skin bruises, and minds grow heavy under the weight of encounters that blur together until faces and voices merge into a single, indistinct memory. And still, there are small moments that remind them they are more than the sum of these nights. A sudden snowstorm that muffles the city into silence. A shared joke that leaves everyone in the parlor laughing until they can't catch their breath. A letter from a sister announcing the birth of a child. These fragments are as precious as the rubles they earn, because they hint at a life beyond the walls, a self that exists outside the ledger. The city's hierarchy filters into the brothel to officers are treated differently than dock workers, merchants differently than clerks. Sometimes the women are sent out to private apartments, their absence noted in the ledger and timed down to the minute. Other times they remain in the house for days without leaving, the outside world reduced to the sound of sleigh bells passing under the window. The madam speaks of expansion, of opening a second house nearer the market. But the madam speaks of expansion, of opening a second house nearer the market. Women know this means little for them, except perhaps a change in walls and the faces they see each night. As the lamp oil burns low and the hour grows late, you realize that this world exists in layers, one that the empire sees and regulates, and another that belongs only to the women who inhabit it. It is a world of compromises and quiet rebellions, of rules followed just enough to survive, and of secrets kept close because they are all that truly belong to you. And in the next part of our journey, we will leave this particular house to follow one of its residents through the frost-bitten streets into the unregulated quarters of the city, where the Empire's gaze falters and danger sharpens its teeth. Frost stings at your face the moment you step back into the night, the brothel door closing behind with a finality that seems to erase its warmth from your skin almost instantly, leaving only the smell of coal smoke lingering faintly in your clothes. Snow crunches underfoot in the rhythm of measured steps, your breath rising in small clouds that catch the lamplight before dissolving into the dark. The street here is quieter than before, but as you move farther from the regulated quarters, the orderliness of the Empire's gaze begins to fray. The lamps are spaced farther apart, some unlit entirely, leaving pockets of shadow where figures linger, neither fully hidden nor entirely revealed. These are the unregulated zones, where sex work operates outside the permission of the yellow ticket system, and where the risks multiply with each transaction. Here, there is no madam keeping a ledger for the police, no weekly medical inspections, no building with a license displayed discreetly near the door. There are only rooms rented by the hour, staircases that smell of damp wood and mildew, and street corners where the cold creeps up through worn leather boots. Women here are often those who have lost their legal right to work in the regulated system, some because they fell ill and could not meet the Empire's health requirements, others because they refused the inspections or simply could not afford the fees and bribes that kept their names in the yellow ticket register. For them, survival means improvisation, meeting clients in alleyways, in the back rooms of taverns thick with tobacco smoke, in boarding houses where the landlord turns a blind eye so long as the rent is paid in full. The unregulated world is a tangle of danger and autonomy. There is no oversight to demand compliance, but also no safety net when violence comes swiftly, as it often does. Disease moves quickly here, and so does desperation. The Empire's newspapers occasionally publish warnings about these clandestine workers, casting them as threats to public health and morality, but rarely do they acknowledge why so many women end up here in the first place. Follow one of them, now a young woman, with a scarf pulled high over her mouth, her eyes darting between the few men who pass and the shadows where she knows others are watching. She is cautious, but she cannot afford to be idle. A day without clients means a night without food or coal. When a man in a heavy wool coat approaches, his gait unsteady from drink, she measures the risk and accepts, leading him down a side street toward a building whose crooked doorway is marked by nothing but a faint smear of candlelight in the window above. Inside, the walls are close and the air damp, the smell of boiled potatoes from some unseen kitchen mingling with the sharper scent of cheap spirits. The landlord, a wiry man with eyes like chipped slate, collects his share without speaking. In this room, there is no pretense of glamour, just a bed with a sagging mattress, a single candle, and the faint draft of wind that slips through cracks in the frame. The transaction is quick, and when it is over, she pulls her scarf back up and slips into the street, blending into the flow of pedestrians as if nothing has happened. These unregulated women form their own loose alliances, much like their counterparts in the licensed houses, but here the bonds are forged under greater strain. They share news of violent clients, warn each other of police patrols, because though their work is not exactly illegal, it is punishable in ways that can destroy what little stability they have. A night in the police station can mean missed earnings, loss of a rented room, or worse, being sent to a labor colony under the charge of vagrancy. And yet, within this precarious existence, there are moments of stubborn resilience. In a tavern, near the docks, a group of women gather at the same table each week, pooling coins to pay for the funeral of a friend who died unnamed in a charity hospital. In a cramped attic room, another keeps a stray cat for company, feeding it scraps from her own meals, because the warmth of a living creature makes the cold more bearable. Even here, humor survives dark, sometimes biting, but enough to let Them laugh at the absurdity of the men who believe themselves masters of the transaction. A sailor might boast of his travels, only to mispronounce the name of the city he claims to have conquered with his charm. A young clerk might demand the air of a prince while fumbling with his coins as though they might vanish before he pays. These moments are small victories, ways of reclaiming a sense of self in a life where identity is too often reduced to survival. The empire pretends that by regulating prostitution, it has contained its realities, but these streets are proof otherwise living. Maps of human need and ingenuity, of transactions that defy both morality and control. Snow continues to fall, layering over the uneven footprints of the night, softening the edges of the city's hardest corners. Somewhere, a church bell tolls the hour, its sound stretching thin in the cold air, and you realize that this unregulated world runs parallel to the official one, unseen yet essential to the city's rhythm. As you follow the young woman back toward the faint glow of the main street, you can't help but wonder how many others walk these same paths, invisible until a lamp catches the edge of their scarf or the shadow of their face. In the next part, we'll step inside a police station on one of these winter nights, not from the side of authority, but through the eyes of a woman brought in from the street, her yellow ticket long gone, her story about to be reduced to a line in a ledger she will never see again. The police station is warmer than the street outside, but the heat here is the kind that dries the air and carries the faint metallic tang of the stove's iron belly, as if it has been fed too much coal. In too small a room, you step inside behind her, the young woman whose scarf is now pulled down, revealing cheeks still flushed from the cold, though the flush is already fading into the pallor of someone who has been caught. The door shuts with a hollow sound that makes the room feel smaller. The light comes from a pair of oil lamps hanging unevenly on the wall, their glass chimneys smudged with soot. The floor is worn smooth by decades of boots, and the air is a mixture of damp wool, pipe smoke, and the faint scent of paper ink, because here, in this place, everything becomes an entry in a book. At the desk sits a clerk in a frayed uniform, his pen already poised over an open ledger. He does not look up when she steps forward, only flicks his eyes toward the policeman who brought her in, as if the explanation is unnecessary. Behind him, shelves sag under the weight of files bound with twine, their labels curling with age. Each one holds stories that were never told aloud, names, dates, charges, and the unspoken consequences that followed. The policeman removes his gloves slowly, tapping them against his palm before speaking. His voice is flat, almost bored. Unregistered prostitution, taken from the unlicensed quarter, no yellow ticket. The clerk begins to write, the scratching of his pen filling the silence. Like a small, relentless insect, the young woman answers the clerk's questions with the economy of someone who knows the cost of too much truth. Her name, her place of birth, her age, all given in a tone that leaves no room for further conversation. The questions are formulaic, but the pauses between them stretch long, filled by the occasional crack of the stove and the muffled voices from somewhere deeper in the building. There is another woman here too, seated on a bench against the wall, her posture folded in on itself, as though she is trying to disappear into the wood. She wears a shawl patterned with faded roses, and her eyes are fixed on the floor. You wonder if she has been here before, if she knows the sequence of events by heart. The questions, the writing, the moment when her fate is decided by someone whose eyes never meet hers. In one corner of the room, a notice board is covered with paper slips missing persons, police bulletins, and the occasional moral warning printed in bold Cyrillic letters, urging citizens to report undesirable activities. The irony is thick. The very system that claims to protect morality is the one that shuffles these women through its doors without ever considering the lives behind the charges. When the questions end, the clerk blots the page, the paper absorbing the ink. like snow taking in the night's shadows. The young woman is told she will be examined by a doctor in the morning to determine her fitness for work language that pretends at health and welfare, but is, in truth, just another measure of control. Until then, she will stay in one of the holding rooms. The policeman gestures toward a narrow hallway, its floor colder than the main room, and leads her past a row of doors with small barred windows. The holding room is sparse. A bench against one wall, a bucket in the corner, and a single blanket that smells faintly of damp and lye. The air is heavy here, with the stale scent of those who have passed through before. She sits, pulling the blanket around her shoulders, and for a moment there is only the sound of her breathing and the occasional creak from the wood above. Somewhere down the hall, a man coughs deep and ragged, and the sound echoes through the yow. Thin walls. In the dim light, her hands find the frayed edge of the blanket, rubbing it between her fingers as if the texture could anchor her to something beyond these walls. Outside, the night continues without pause, the crunch of boots on snow, the faint jingle of sleigh bells from the main road, the distant call of a street vendor, still selling roasted chestnuts to those who have not yet gone home. But in here, time feels suspended. She knows that in the morning, the doctor's verdict could mean being sent back to the street, being assigned to a licensed brothel if she passes inspection, or being dispatched to a workhouse if she fails. There is no appeal, no space to argue, just the quiet machinery of an empire that reduces lives to categories and entries in a book. And yet, even here, she holds on to a thought that the system cannot quite touch, the memory of a summer afternoon. In her village, the sound of the wind moving through tall grass, the smell of fresh bread cooling on a windowsill. It is small, fragile, and almost absurd against the weight of the present, but it is hers. The other woman on the bench stirs, glancing over with a faint nod that is both acknowledgement and solidarity. No words pass between them. They would only be swallowed by the thick air, but the gesture is enough to say, you are not entirely alone. In this way, the station becomes a place of strange duality's cold authority on the surface, and beneath it, fleeting threads of humanity that persist in defiance of the ledgers and laws. And as the oil lamp flickers low, casting uneven shadows along the walls, you realize that the real record of these nights is not in the books on the clerk's shelf, but in the quiet exchanges, the moments of endurance, the memories carried away when the door finally opens again. In the next part, we'll follow her beyond the police station, into the workhouse where many of these women were sent under the guise of rehabilitation, and see how the empire's idea of reform often deepened the very wounds it claimed to heal. The morning light that seeps into the police station is pale and reluctant, filtered through frost-etched windows that turn it into a dim, cold wash across the walls. By the time the doctor arrives, his boots leaving wet prints on the worn floorboards, the young woman has already been moved from the holding room to a small side chamber where the examination will take place. The space is functional to the point of bleakness. A narrow table with a thin blanket folded over it, a chair pushed against the wall, a basin of water that has already cooled in the drafty air. The doctor, his collar buttoned high and his beard neatly trimmed, conducts the inspection with the brisk detachment of someone handling a routine task, his voice low and clipped as he dictates notes to a waiting assistant. There is no discussion, no explanation, just the cold sequence of observation, recording, and judgment. When it is over, she is told, in the same neutral tone, that she will be transferred to a workhouse for rehabilitation and moral improvement, the phrase delivered, as if it were a kind of mercy. Outside, a horse-drawn wagon waits, its bed enclosed by wooden slats, and she climbs in with 3 other women, all bound for the same destination. The streets roll by in a blur of snowbanks and shuttered shopfronts, the wheels crunching through. Ice-rutted roads, the breath of the horses clouding the air in steady plumes. The workhouse looms at the end of a long, straight road on the city's edge, a brick building with narrow, high windows that seem to watch rather than welcome. The gate swings open with a groan, and the women are led inside by a matron whose heavy skirt swishes with each step, the keys on her belt clinking softly. The first impression is of order rows of wooden benches, floors scrubbed to a dull shine, the smell of soap sharp in the air. But underneath it is something heavier, the quiet press of rules that fill every space like an invisible weight. Each woman is given a coarse dress of gray wool, its sleeves worn thin at the elbows, and a pair of rough shoes that pinch at the toes. Their own clothes are taken away, bundled without ceremony into a storeroom that smells of mothballs and dust. The day's rhythm is announced by a bell. Work begins at dawn and continues until the light fades. In the laundry room, steam rises from great copper vats where linens are boiled, the heat mingling with the smell of lye until it coats the back of the throat. The women stand in pairs, scrubbing cloth against washboards, their knuckles reddened. By the water, their shoulders aching from the constant motion. In the sewing room, the air is cooler, but no less relentless, the click of needles and the hum of thread through fabric forming a ceaseless background to whispered conversations. Talking is permitted only in low voices, and only when it does. Not slow the pace of work. Meals are taken in silence. A tin bowl of thin cabbage soup, a heel of bread, sometimes a small slice of boiled potato, if supplies allow. The matron moves among them during meals, her gaze sweeping the room as if counting not just the women, but their compliance. In theory, the workhouse exists to reform, to teach discipline, provide shelter, and guide women away from what the empire deemed a life of vice. In reality, it functions as another kind of brothel, though here the commodity is not the body's intimacy, but its labor. The city benefits from clean laundry, mended uniforms, and the quiet removal of women from the streets, while the women themselves rarely leave with more than what they arrived with, except perhaps a deeper understanding of how the system prefers them contained. Still, within these walls, there are moments that escape the reach of the rules. A scrap of music hummed under the breath while folding sheets, a gesture of shared bread when one woman's portion is smaller than the rest, a whispered prayer. Before sleep whispered into the crook of an arm, so the words are kept close. At night, the dormitory is a long room lined with narrow cots, each with a thin blanket and a pillow that smells faintly of starch. The windows are high enough that only the sky is visible, a square of darkness punctuated by the occasional flake of snow drifting past. The women lie facing in the same direction, the sound of their breathing blending into the slow rhythm of sleep or the quiet wakefulness of those who cannot find rest. Somewhere down the hall, a bell rings softly to mark the changing of the night. Watch! The young woman turns toward the wall, her hands tucked under her cheek, and imagines the sound of the river in her village, the way it would thaw in spring with a groan and a rush that carried winter away. It is not freedom, but it is a kind of warmth that survives in the mind. In the sewing room the next day, an older woman with silver, threaded through her hair, leans close and tells her in a near whisper about a small escape how some women, after months in the workhouse, are sent to respectable employment as maids or laundresses, sometimes in distant towns where no one knows their past. It is a slim chance, and often it means trading one form of servitude for another, but it is a thread to hold on to. The young woman listens, not because she believes it will happen for her, but because the act of hearing such a possibility is enough to make the day feel less like a sentence carved in stone. Outside, the winter light slips lower, and the smell of coal smoke from the kitchen begins to thread through the halls. Tomorrow will be the same as today. Bells, work, silence, but for now there is a pause, a moment between tasks when the rules are still, but the women's eyes are alive with unspoken thoughts. And in the next part of our journey, we will follow one such rehabilitated woman into her new life as a domestic servant, to see whether the Empire's promise of a second chance was truth, or just another doorway into a different kind of confinement. The wagon that takes her away from the workhouse rattles over the frozen ruts of the road, the boards beneath her creaking with each turn, and the city unfolding in a pale winter haze. She has been told she is rehabilitated, though the word feels strange in her mouth, like something too heavy to swallow. The matron's parting words were delivered in the same clipped tone she used for everything. She is to serve as a domestic in the home of a merchant's widow, a position the authorities consider respectable, safe, and a clean severing from her past. The journey to the widow's house is not long, but it is enough for the city to change its face. The grim brick of the workhouse and the narrow streets near it give way to wide boulevards, lined with linden trees whose bare branches scratch against the low sky, to houses with tall windows curtained in lace, their steps swept clean of snow. The widow's home stands on a quiet corner, its facade pale, and its door painted a deep green that is polished enough to catch the light. She is led inside by a servant in a neat, dark uniform, and the first thing she notices is the smell of faint trace of beeswax polish, dried lavender in bowls set on small tables, and the richer undercurrent of coffee brewing somewhere unseen. The widow herself appears in the doorway to the parlor, her figure slender but upright, her black dress buttoned high at the throat, her hair silver but carefully pinned. She does not smile, but her gaze lingers, taking in the cut of the gray wool dress the workhouse has given her, the way her hands are folded in front of her. "You will keep the upper floors," she says simply, as though this is already agreed upon, and turns away, expecting her to follow. The upper floors are warm but dim, the light filtered through heavy curtains to protect the carpets and upholstery from fading. There is dust to be swept, beds to be made, chamber pots to be emptied discreetly before breakfast is served downstairs. It is quiet work, but it is work nonetheless, and the house holds its own kind of discipline. The hours are fixed. Rise before dawn to heat water for washing, dust the stair rails before the widow descends for her morning coffee, polish the brass on the door handles once a week, whether it needs it or not. Meals are taken in the kitchen, apart from the household, and always in the same portion: a ladle of soup, a slice of bread, a cup of tea if the kitchen maid is in a generous mood. The city outside continues its rhythms, but from the upper windows, the streets are just moving shadows and the occasional sound of carriage wheels. She is not watched in the same way she was in the workhouse, but the awareness of being replaceable hangs in the air, as constant as the ticking of the tall clock in the hallway. The widow does not ask about her past, but she does not have to. Her references have been arranged by the workhouse, the gaps in her history smoothed over just enough to pass inspection. Still, there are moments when the silence between them feels weighted, as though both know more than is spoken. On Sundays, when the widow attends church, she is left alone in the house for several hours. At first, she uses the time to rest, sitting by the window with her mending, listening to the faint bells from the church and the distant calls of street vendors. But gradually, she begins to walk, just small circles through the nearby streets, careful to return before the widow does, her boots leaving thin prints in the snow that the wind soon erases. The freedom is fragile, but it reminds her of her own existence beyond the walls she serves. In the market square one morning, she passes a woman she knew from the brothel years ago, the recognition quick and wordless. They do not stop, but in. That glance is a world of shared memory, of nights and places the city would rather pretend did not exist. Back at the widow's, she polishes silver that rarely leaves its cabinet, irons linens so crisp they feel like paper, and sometimes in nine. The quiet of the laundry room hums a song she remembers from her childhood. It is not the life she imagined, but it is a life with fewer immediate dangers than the street or the unlicensed quarters. And yet, even here, the control is subtle but complete. Her pay is small, her hours long, her role in the household fixed. The house may be warmer than the workhouse, the food a little richer, but the terms are still dictated by someone else. Once, while dusting the library, she finds a book pressed with a flower so brittle it crumbles at her touch. For a moment, the scent of it faint, dry, sweet pulls her somewhere else entirely, to a field in summer, to the kind of air she hasn't breathed in years. She slips one petal into her pocket, not for any practical reason, but because it feels like keeping something that is hers alone. And perhaps that is the truest measure of survival in all these shifting worlds of the Empire's design, not escape in the dramatic sense, but the quiet, stubborn act of holding on to small private fragments of self. In the next part of our journey, we will step beyond her story for a moment and look at the broader picture, the ways the Russian Empire's regulation and exploitation of sex work intertwined with its politics, economy, and the unspoken machinery that kept certain truths buried under the weight of official history. When you step back from the narrow lanes, from the dim staircases and quiet rooms where individual lives unfold, the pattern begins to show itself, not as a neat map, but as a web of threads pulled tight between the Empire's politics, its economy, and its appetite for control. Prostitution in the Russian Empire was not an isolated vice tolerated at the margins. It was a built-in component of the imperial structure, managed and profited from in ways that reached far beyond the women who worked in the brothels or on the streets. The yellow ticket system, so often described in official language as a safeguard for public health, was in practice a mechanism for surveillance, one that allowed the police to track and manage a section of the population, deemed both morally suspect and economically necessary. The medical examinations, recorded in neat cursive in ledgers across the Empire's cities, were less about protecting clients from disease and more about maintaining the fiction that the state could regulate morality the same way it regulated the weights and measures in the marketplace. Each licensed brothel paid fees, not just for the initial registration, but for ongoing inspections and renewals, creating a steady flow of revenue into municipal coffers. Merchants who leased properties to brothel keepers paid taxes on those buildings, and in some cases, influential landlords made far more money renting to such businesses than they ever could from respectable tenants. Even the workhouses played their part, supplying cheap labor to government institutions and private contractors under the guise of rehabilitation. The Empire's bureaucracy treated these women as a category to be managed, not as citizens with agency. This is why their stories rarely appear in the official archives, except as numbers. How many were registered in a given year? How many failed? Medical inspection. How many were reformed through workhouse placement? Behind those numbers were lives of complexity, adaptation, and contradiction. Some women used the system to their advantage, leveraging their connections with police, officials, or wealthy clients to secure better lodgings or escape punitive measures. Others were caught in its tightening grip, their yellow ticket becoming a permanent barrier to other forms of work, their identity fixed in the eyes of the state as unchangeable. The politics of it ran deeper still. In times of unrest, such as the strikes and protests that rippled through Russia in the early 20th century, the police often increased raids in the unlicensed quarters, not just to enforce morality laws, but to scatter gatherings where political dissent might mingle with the informal economy. The idea was simple: keep the vulnerable busy surviving, and they will have no energy left to organize. And yet, the web was never perfectly woven. Unlicensed prostitution persisted in every major city, in villages along the trade routes, even in the shadow of military barracks. Soldiers on leave became a reliable source of income for women in port towns and garrison cities, their wages circulating through the same taverns, boarding houses, and alleyways that the police officially condemned. In rural areas where the state's reach was less immediate, prostitution often took the form of seasonal arrangements tied to fairs or harvest labor, operating outside any registration system altogether. The economic currents here were subtle, but undeniable. Money earned in these transactions fed back into the same markets that supplied bread to the capital, coal to the factories, and textiles to the army. It is tempting to think of the empire as a monolithic force pressing down from above, but its control was not always direct. It relied on layers of complicity from landlords, tavern keepers, doctors, and even clients who preferred the security of the regulated system. And in that layered complicity, there was also space small but real for subversion. Women sometimes formed arrangements with sympathetic officials who would delay inspections, alter records, or look the other way entirely in exchange for favors, payment, or loyalty. These were not acts of charity. They were trades as much a part of the economy as the transactions that took place behind closed doors. Looking at it from this higher vantage, the personal stories you've followed so far are threads in a fabric woven for purposes they did not choose. Yet it was their lives, their labor, and their bodies that kept that fabric from unraveling. The empire could lecture about morality in its public speeches, and still rely on the taxes and fees generated by the very thing it condemned. It could write laws in the language of protection, while ensuring those laws locked people into roles from which escape was nearly impossible. And all the while, the ledger books grew heavier, filled with neat lines of ink that would outlast the women, whose names they recorded. In the next part, we will return to the ground level, to follow one of those threads into a provincial town where the system looks different, on the surface less formal, less policed, but where the same force's shape lives in ways that are both familiar and startling. The road to the provincial town is long enough for the air to change, losing the sharp tang of coal smoke that hangs over the capital and taking on something quieter, a mix of wood smoke from stoves and the faint, almost sweet scent of hay stored in lofts for the winter. The snow here lies deeper and less trampled, its surface marked mostly by the narrow tracks of sledges and the scattered footprints of people whose lives move at a slower pace. When you arrive, the town seems to unfold all at once. A main street lined with wooden shop fronts painted in muted colors, their signs carved in Cyrillic letters that creak on their hinges in the wind. A small market square with a frozen fountain. At its center, a church with an onion dome that catches what little sunlight filters through the clouds. On the surface, it feels far removed from the capital's rigid systems, and in some ways, it is. There is no police office dedicated to monitoring prostitution here, no formal yellow ticket register with clerks hunched over ledgers. But that does not mean the trade does not exist. It simply moves differently, blending into the fabric of the town in ways that make it harder to separate from everyday life. Women here work from rooms above taverns, from cottages at the edge of town, from small stalls in the market where the sale of bread or vodka is accompanied by quiet offers made to those who know to ask. Some are widows or wives of men away in the army. Others are young women from nearby villages who come into town during the winter months, when there is little work in the fields. The arrangements are looser, often seasonal, and payments are just as likely to be made in sacks of grain, cured meat, or firewood as in coins. The taverns are the beating heart of this economy. In one, the smell of rye bread and boiling cabbage fills the air, mingling with the sharper fumes of home-brewed spirits, poured from cloudy glass bottles. A stove in the corner radiates heat, its surface covered with drying mittens and scarves, and in the dim light, you can see the quiet transactions unfolding, hands resting a little too long on a shoulder, a whispered sentence between sips of beer, a nod toward the stairs in the back. There is no madam here, no central authority dictating rules, but there are still unspoken agreements. The tavern owner turns a blind eye so long as a portion of the earnings stays behind the bar, and the women keep an informal watch over one another, stepping in when a customer's tone shifts from friendly to dangerous. Without the empire's official oversight, there is more freedom, but also more risk. If trouble comes, there is no legal protection, and a woman's reputation in a small town can be both a shield and a trap. Everyone knows everyone, and gossip moves faster than the wind across the frozen river. Yet there is also a kind of intimacy here that the city cannot replicate. Clients are often familiar faces, neighbors, old schoolmates, men whose families have known yours for generations. This familiarity can breed a gentler sort of transaction, one wrapped in the shared knowledge of life's hardships, but it can also make refusal more complicated. The market square on a Saturday is a study in these blurred lines. Women in wool. Headscarves stand behind stalls laden with dried fish, root vegetables, and jars of pickled cucumbers, their eyes flicking towards certain passers-by in a way that means more than just an interest in selling produce. In the evening, when the church bells mark the end of the day, those same women might be seen walking along the riverbank with men whose coats are buttoned tight against the wind, their paths bending toward the same unlit cottages on the outskirts. The provincial system is less about control and more about quiet accommodation, an understanding between townsfolk that certain needs will be met so long as they remain discreet. Yet this discretion does not erase the vulnerabilities. There are stories whispered over tea about a girl who left for the city, with a man promising work as a seamstress and was never heard from again. About a soldier who returned from the front and brought more than just his pay in his pockets. About a widow who traded her last store of flour for enough coal to keep her children from freezing through a February night. In these smaller places, survival is a shared enterprise, and the line between respectability and scandal is as thin as the ice on the river when spring first arrives. The empire's gaze may not be as heavy here, but its influence is still felt in the taxes on taverns, in the soldiers who pass through, in the occasional inspector who arrives from the district capital and leaves with his pockets a little heavier than before. The women know that the quiet here is a kind of bargain, one that can change without warning, and may move through their days with the same mix of caution and resilience that shapes their counterparts in the city. As the snow begins to fall, again softening the edges of the town's wooden houses, you can see the faint glow of lamps in the tavern windows, a signal that another night's work is about to begin. And in the next part, we will follow one of these provincial women through the turning of the seasons, to see how the rhythms of the trade shift with the thaw of spring, the heat of summer, and the slow return of winter's hold dot in the provinces. The calendar is not marked only by numbered dates on a wall, but by the feel of the air, the smell of the earth, and the color of the river's surface. And for a woman working in the trade here, each season brings its own set of opportunities and dangers. Winter holds the longest nights, when the snow reflects the faint glow of oil lamps, and sleigh bells carry across the frozen streets like notes in a hollow song. This is when work is most steady, for the cold drives men into taverns early and keeps them there until the hour grows late, their coin loosened by drink, and the knowledge that the outside air will bite harder than any empty bed. In these months, she wears layers of wool and wraps a scarf high around her chin, the ends trailing down her coat, her cheeks raw from the wind but flushed enough to catch a glance. The tavern is a refuge from the wind, its heat built from bodies, as much as from the stove, and the quiet negotiations happen in corners while boots drip melted snow onto the floorboards. In the depths of January, the frozen river becomes a shortcut between districts, and she sometimes walks across it to meet a client in another part of town, the ice beneath her boots groaning in the dark. When the thaw comes, it happens in stages, the first trickle of water under the ice, the smell of damp earth rising from the edges of the road, the way the air softens against the skin. Spring is a restless season. The snowmelt brings traders, peddlers, and laborers moving through on their way to markets and planting fields, and with them comes a different kind of work. The men are often strangers who will not be in town long, eager to spend what they've earned before moving on, and she learns to listen for accents, to adjust her tone and her price to suit a man who may have slept the last week in a barn or traveled by rail from a city hundreds of versts away. The risk in spring is the river's flooding, which can cut off parts of the town and keep her trapped in one district for days, forcing her to rely on familiar clients or on barter when coin is scarce. By summer, the town exhales. The days are long, the night short, and much of the work shifts outdoors, to benches in the shadows of trees, to paths along the riverbank, to barns with doors left open to let the breeze pass through. The heat changes everything. Men drink more beer than spirits. Conversations stretch longer before the unspoken agreements are reached, and the risk of discovery is greater because the streets never truly empty until the sky fades to deep blue. She wears lighter dresses in summer, sometimes barefoot when the ground is dry, her hair tied up to keep her neck cool. The market becomes the hub, its stalls piled high with berries, bread, and fresh-caught fish, and it is there that glances and gestures pass unnoticed among the swirl of trade. Summer also brings festivals, saints' days, weddings, and fairs when strangers flood the town in numbers too great for the small constabulary to control, and the work can be brisk, the earnings enough to carry her through the leaner months. But summer is fleeting, and the first chill of autumn arrives not with frost, but with the scent of smoke curling from chimneys at dusk. The leaves turn, the evenings darken earlier, and the men grow restless again, aware that the cold will soon return. This is a profitable time. The harvest brings pockets full of payment from labor, and the work is steady as farmers, traders, and even young men from neighboring villages seek company before the long winter sets in. In autumn, she moves her work indoors again, renting a small room above a shop where the walls keep out most of the wind and where a lamp in the window serves as both light and signal. The food in these months is richer stews thick with root vegetables, bread still warm from the oven, and she sometimes shares a meal with a client before the night's work, knowing that a full stomach and a bit of warmth make the cold days easier to bear. Through all of this, the rhythm of the seasons is not just a backdrop, but a partner in the work, shaping who comes, how much they bring, and how the nights unfold. She learns to plan for the lean stretches, to save what she can. In summer for the deep winter, when the river freezes and travel slows. She knows which seasons bring risk of illness, spring's damp, and summer's fevers, and which offer brief spells of comfort. The provincial year is a cycle of adaptation, a slow-turning wheel. It demands attention to detail and a memory for the past. And always, the empire's shadow is there, even if it does not fall as heavily as in the capital occasional patrols in winter, tax collectors in autumn, the presence of soldiers during summer fairs. She moves with it, not against it, because survival here is not about breaking the wheel, but about staying just outside its crushing spokes. And as the year turns again toward winter, she pulls her wool coat from the chest at the foot of her bed, smooths the scarf she will wrap against the cold, and listens for the sound of the first sleigh bells that will carry her back into the season, where the nights are longest and the work is most certain. In the next part, we will leave her behind for a moment and turn to the men, the clients themselves, to see who they were, what brought them to this trade, and how their lives intersected with the women's in ways both transactional and unexpectedly human. To understand the full shape of this shadowed economy, you cannot only follow the women, you must also watch the men who came to them, because without their presence, their coin, and their silences, the system would not have sustained itself for so long. They arrived in different ways, from different roads, carrying the weight of Lives lived under the same empire, but in vastly different worlds. Some came in uniformed soldiers, on leave from barracks or back from the front lines, their boots still dusted with the mud of distant provinces, their faces marked by wind and discipline. They were often young, some barely older than the women. They visited, and they carried themselves with the restless energy of those who had lived too long in the company of other men. For them, the visit could be a release, a reminder of softness after months of barrack life, but also a habit reinforced by the culture of the military, where brothels were spoken of openly in the language of necessity. Others came from the merchant class, wrapped in heavy coats with fur collars, their gloves lined with kid leather, their movements slower, deliberate. They treated the transaction as part of the evening's business, no more or less important than the deal they had struck. Earlier in the day, for a shipment of grain or timber, these men sometimes returned to the same woman over weeks or months, cultivating a kind of arrangement that blurred into familiarity, though the terms were always understood by both. Then there were the clerks and low-level civil servants, men whose days were spent hunched over ledgers or carrying messages through drafty corridors, earning just enough to keep themselves housed, but not enough to court in the respectable sense. For them, a visit to a brothel or a discreet meeting with a woman in the unlicensed quarter was less about status and more about access to something otherwise out of reach. Dock workers, factory hands, and laborers came too, though less often to the licensed establishments. Their coins were fewer, their time off shorter, and their preferences leaned toward the taverns and unregistered, rooms where prices could be bargained down and formalities were absent. In the provinces, the line between client and neighbor was thin, sometimes non-existent. A man might buy bread from a woman in the morning market and visit her room that evening, the exchange woven into the rhythm of daily life without anyone speaking of it directly. Among the more unusual visitors were travelers, peddlers moving goods between towns, itinerant musicians, even actors from small traveling troupes. They brought with them stories from elsewhere, bits of gossip, news of political unrest, or simply fresh eyes on a place that had grown familiar to its residents. The women valued such men not only for the coin they carried, but for the fragments of the wider world they left behind in conversation, in gifts as small as a ribbon or as practical as a loaf of bread from a distant city's bakery. The motives that brought these men through the door were as varied as their backgrounds. Loneliness was common, though few would name it aloud. Desire was obvious, though often tangled with power, curiosity, or the urge to escape the confines of their own lives, if only for an hour. For some, the encounter was an act of indulgence, a mark of prosperity. For others, it was an occasional necessity, no different in their minds from paying for a meal or a place to sleep. Yet across these differences, there was an unspoken code. Men who visited regularly knew to treat certain women with care if they wished to be welcomed again. They learned which rooms to request, which hours were quietest, which madams or tavern. Keepers could be trusted to keep their presence discreet. Even in the unregulated quarters, where the risk was greater for both sides, there was often an understanding if trouble broke out. Both client and worker might find themselves in the same police ledger, and that was to be avoided at all costs. In the city, some of the wealthier clients developed reputations among the women as patrons funding new dresses, paying for medicine, or helping to cover rent in exchange for favored treatment. These arrangements could last months or even years, until they ended abruptly with a change in fortune, a move to another city, or the sudden decision to marry a respectable woman. In such cases, the past was quietly erased in public, but never forgotten in the quieter corners of memory. What tied all these men together, despite their differences, was the way their visits fed into the same network of money and silence that allowed the empire system to persist. Every coin spent on a night's company was a coin that rippled outward to the brothel owner, the landlord, the tavern keeper, the police inspector expecting his due, and finally to the municipal accounts that kept the whole apparatus polished with a veneer of legality. Yet beneath that, in the unmeasured spaces between transactions, there were moments that could not be easily categorized. A soldier sharing a story of a lost comrade, a merchant listening quietly to a woman's description of her hometown, a dock worker slipping an extra loaf of bread into her hands on his way out the door. These moments did not erase the imbalance between them, but they revealed that even in a system built on exploitation, the human need for recognition of being seen, of being heard, could flicker briefly into existence before the night closed over it again. And in the next part, we will turn to those rare spaces where the boundaries between client and companion blurred entirely, where long-term arrangements and unofficial partnerships created a world within a world, hidden in plain sight from both. The Empire's record books and the casual observer. These arrangements began quietly, often without either side naming them for what they were, taking shape over a series of visits that grew less about negotiation and more about the unspoken expectation that there would be another meeting, and another after that. In the licensed brothels, a man might request the same woman each time, and the madam, ever attuned to the patterns that kept her business steady, would make sure she was available, adjusting schedules to accommodate what she saw as a profitable loyalty. In the unlicensed quarters or the provincial towns, the pattern could be even subtler. He would simply find her, whether in the same tavern corner or at the same market stall, and their conversations would begin where they had left off the last time, as though the days between had been nothing more than a pause in a single, ongoing thread. These were not relationships in the sense the Empire's marriage registries understood. They were neither sanctioned nor protected, and yet they carried their own set of rules. A man who saw the same woman regularly might pay her rent, bring her food, or gift her small luxuries, a silk scarf, a brooch, a bottle of imported perfume, knowing these things would not only make her life easier, but also tie her circumstances a little closer to his. In return, she might reserve her best dress for his visits, keep a bottle of his preferred drink on hand, or offer a kind of attentiveness that blurred into something resembling care. It was a form of barter where the currency was not just coin, but consistency, a stability rare in a world where most encounters were fleeting. For some women, such an arrangement offered a measure of safety. A regular client could mean fewer nights spent with strangers, fewer risks, and a steadier income. For others, it was a trap in softer clothing, a reliance on one man's favor that could vanish with a single change in mood or fortune. In the capital, there were whispered stories of women who had lived for years under the patronage of a wealthy official or merchant, their apartments paid for, their wardrobes replenished each season, their place in his life secure until the day he decided to marry or leave the city. In the provinces, these arrangements were often more modest, but no less binding. A man might ensure a woman's firewood was stocked through the winter in exchange for exclusive company when he was in town, or he might trade goods from his farm for her loyalty, both knowing that loyalty was as much a practical agreement as it was an emotional one. Over time, some of these connections deepened into something that even the participants struggled to name. They might share meals not just in a room, but in public spaces, attend fairs together, or exchange letters when separated by work or travel. And in those letters, there were sometimes lines that spoke of longing, of missing not just the physical presence, but the conversation, the shared jokes, the small rituals that had grown between them. Yet both understood the limits. She knew that his life beyond their meetings, his family, his business, his reputation, existed in a sphere she would never enter. He knew that she might still see others, whether out of necessity or choice, and that her world contained rooms and conversations he would never witness. The Empire's records had no place for such nuance. In the ledgers, he was merely another client, She another registered worker? A frequency of their meetings invisible to the state's gaze. But in the private geography of their lives, these arrangements could be as significant as any official union, shaping where they went, how they spent their money, and even how they thought of themselves. Some ended abruptly, with a disappearance, an arrest, or a sudden change in circumstance. Others faded slowly, the visits becoming less frequent until they stopped altogether. A few, rare and persistent, lasted for years, weathering the turns of the seasons and the shifting tides of fortune, sustained by a balance of mutual benefit and unspoken understanding. And in those rare cases, when the man's life took him elsewhere, he might leave behind more than gifts, a key to a small apartment, a sum of money hidden in a box, or a letter with no signature, but words that made clear what could never be said aloud. These arrangements, invisible to the casual observer and unrecorded by the empire, were the quiet veins running through the larger body of the trade, carrying not just money, but the fragments of intimacy that survived in a system designed to reduce everything to transaction. In the next part, we will step into one of the empire's port cities, where the constant movement of ships, sailors, and merchants created a version of the trade that was both more volatile and more cosmopolitan, shaped by tides, foreign coins, and the unending arrival and departure of strangers. The port greets you before you see it, its presence announced in the mingled scents of brine, tar, fish, and coal smoke carried inland on the wind, the cries of gulls cutting through the low thrum of ship bells, and the shouts of dockhands hauling crates across slick planks. Here, in this city where the water is as much a road as the cobbled streets, the trade wears a different face, one shaped by the tides and the unending arrival of strangers. Ships from across the Baltic, from Western Europe, from the Black Sea, anchor in the harbor, their hulls streaked with salt, their decks crowded with sailors eager for the feel of solid ground beneath their boots. The dockside streets are lined with taverns and boarding houses, their signs painted in multiple languages to catch the attention of those who speak little or no Russian. Inside, the air is heavy with tobacco smoke and the yeasty warmth of beer drawn from wooden kegs, the tables crowded with men from half a dozen ports, their uniforms, jackets, and accents, all signaling journeys that have brought them far from home. The women who work here are as varied as the clientele, some local, some from inland towns drawn by the promise of better earnings, others from distant lands themselves, their speech tinged with Polish, Latvian, or Finnish, and in rare cases, more exotic tongues from ports farther still. The work is volatile here. Some nights are a flood, with ships arriving ahead of a storm, their crews pouring into the streets with pockets full of wages they intend to spend before the wind changes. Other nights are a drought, the harbor quiet, the rooms upstairs empty, except for the sound of the tide against the pilings. The sea sets the rhythm. In the licensed houses near the waterfront, the madams know the ship schedules as well as any harbor master, adjusting prices when a foreign vessel docks, sometimes raising them for men with gold coins instead of rubles, coins that glint strangely under the lamplight and carry the faint smell of another country's air. Unlicensed work thrives here, too, in alleys that smell of fish scales and in the shadowed entrances of warehouses where a quick exchange might be made between the loading of one crate and the unloading of another. The risk is sharper foreign sailors are harder to read, their temperaments unpredictable. Their language is sometimes a barrier that turns simple misunderstandings into dangerous moments, but the rewards can be high, especially if a gift changes. Hands instead of cash, a bolt of cloth from France, a tin of tea from China, a brooch inlaid with glass that catches the light like a gem. The presence of so many outsiders changes the tone of the city itself. There is a certain looseness in the rules here, a sense that the empire's strictures are thinned by salt air and the impermanence of its guests. Police patrols are frequent, but often more interested in extracting bribes than in enforcing regulations. To the letter, a brothel might operate without a license for months, simply by keeping the right inspector supplied with contraband cigars or a share of the takings from the busier nights. For the women, adaptability is the key to survival, learning the greetings in a handful of languages, knowing how to gauge the worth of unfamiliar coins, and perhaps most importantly, knowing when to refuse a man whose walk, voice, or glance signals danger more clearly than words could. The port city is also a place of intersections, where stories from across the world pass in low voices over mugs of beer or whispered in the dim privacy of an upstairs room. A sailor might speak of storms in the North Sea, of ports where the women wear bells on their skirts, of harbors where the air smells of spices instead of coal. For some women, these fragments are just passing noise. For others, they are treasures, glimpses of a wider world they may never see, but can imagine in detail. There is a kind of romance to it, even when the reality is harsh a sense that here, unlike in the steady, insular rhythm of the provinces, the world comes to your doorstep. Yet the volatility cuts both ways. A bad season for shipping a frozen harbor, a blockade, a storm that keeps ships away for weeks, can strip away earnings so quickly that debts mount before the ice has even broken. The sea giveth and the sea taketh, as the dockside saying goes. And for the women whose livelihoods rise and fall with the tides, there is no truer phrase. And still, the port draws them in, with its mix of danger, opportunity, and the constant hum of stories carried on the wind from far-off shores. As evening deepens and the tide begins to turn, lanterns sway in the wind outside the taverns, casting light over the faces of men and women alike, each one navigating the unsteady ground between profit and peril. In the next part, we will step inside one of the busiest waterfront brothels on a night when 3 ships dock at once, to watch how the sudden flood of clients transforms the space into a world of chaos, calculation, and fleeting connection. The brothel sits just a street back from the docks, its windows glowing like warm pockets of light in the damp night air. The flicker of oil lamps caught in the glass as the door swings open and shut with the steady rhythm of incoming boots. Tonight, the harbor is loud with the arrival of 3 ships, 2 merchant vessels, and a smaller, faster schooner, and their crews have poured into the streets like water spilling from a cracked barrel. You can hear the rush of them before you. Even reach the brothel, the laughter edged with relief, the heavy footsteps on wet cobblestones, the barked greetings between men who haven't touched solid ground in weeks. Inside, the air is thick and layered tobacco smoke curling from long pipes, the sharp tang of spirits, the sweeter ghost of perfume clinging to the folds of silk and cotton dresses, and the faint salt still clinging to the men's coats. Madame stands near the entrance, her hair pinned high, a ledger open on the table beside her, but her eyes scan the room more than the page, marking which faces are strangers, which might be repeat customers, which ones will drink heavily before, choosing, and which will want to speak little and leave quickly. The women are already in motion, moving through the crowded space with practiced ease, their skirts brushing against the backs of chairs, their voices rising and falling like small currents in the noise. Some carry trays of drinks, others lean in close to hear a man's request over the din. A few stand in doorways at the base of the staircase that leads to the private rooms above. The sailors bring the sea with them. Their jackets smell faintly of tar and wind, their skin weathered, their hands calloused from ropes and salt spray. Coins clink into palms in quick, practiced exchanges, and in the background, the house musician plucks at a balalaika, the bright notes tumbling above the deeper hum of conversation. Upstairs, rooms fill quickly, the wooden floorboards creaking, under the weight of boots and hurried footsteps. In one, a woman with hair the color of dark ale laughs at a joke in a language she doesn't speak. her laugh as much part of the performance as the painted curve of her lips. In another, a man removes his cap and sets it carefully on the table, as though the small gesture is a kind of ceremony before the night's business begins. Downstairs, in the parlor, a group of younger sailors share a bottle, their voices overlapping. As they swap stories of storms and ports, each one more exaggerated than the last. The women listen with varying degrees of attention, some drawn in by the novelty of the tales, others keeping one eye on the madam to see who might be arriving. Next, the pace tonight is relentless. The madam whispers quick instructions to her staff, ensuring no room sits empty for long, no glass remains unfilled, no opportunity for profit passes unnoticed. In the kitchen, a pot of tea sits beside the bottles, of vodka and rum, ready for those whose coins are thinner, but whose company is still worth keeping. The walls themselves seem to absorb the noise, the laughter, the sudden bursts of song in unfamiliar tongues, the creak of chairs, and the soft thump of boots on the stairs. Yet within the chaos, there are quiet moments, fleeting pockets where connection feels almost unplanned. In the corner, a woman rests her hand lightly on a sailor's forearm as he describes a harbor in the Mediterranean, where the water is so clear you can see the shadows of fish moving beneath your boat. Her eyes soften, not because she plans to go there, but because she can picture it so vividly that for a heartbeat it feels as though she is standing on that sunlit deck. In another room, a merchant pauses before leaving to press a small, folded note into a woman's palm, his expression unreadable, but his touch lingering a fraction longer than the moment requires. By midnight, the air is hotter, heavier, the oil in the lamps burning low, and the sound of coins exchanging hands has become as steady as the rhythm of the tide against the harbor walls. Some men leave early, pockets lighter and faces flushed, their laughter spilling into the street before dissolving into the wider noise of the port. Others stay until the rooms are nearly empty, until the madam begins her subtle sweep of the space, signaling the end of the night's tide. When the door finally closes behind the last client, the brothel exhales into a softer silence. The women gather in the parlor, slipping off their shoes, unpinning their hair, their laughter now quieter, less performed. The madam counts the nights. Earnings, her fingers quick over the coins, the ledger closed with a satisfied tap. Outside, the harbor has stilled, the ships rocking gently in their berths, and the streets are empty, except for the sound of the water lapping at the pilings. Inside, the women pour tea, share the last of a loaf of bread, and speak in low voices about the night's oddities. The sailor who claimed to have seen icebergs the size of palaces, the man who paid in foreign coins stamped with a crowned head. They didn't recognize the merchant who left without ever going upstairs. In the next part, we will follow one of these women when she leaves the brothel in the quiet hours before dawn, walking through the empty port streets to her own small room, carrying with her the night's earnings and the weight of stories she may never tell. The streets have a different voice in the hour before dawn, when the last of the night's noise has burned itself out and the day's bustle has not yet begun to stir. The air feels colder now than it did at midnight, the kind of cold that seeps through layers of wool and presses its weight into the bones. But it is a clean cold, carrying the briny breath of the sea and the faint metallic tang of wet cobblestones. She steps out of the brothel and draws her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The night's earnings tucked safely inside the lining, where the fabric has been discreetly stitched to form a hidden pocket. The lamps along the main dockside street burn low, their flames guttering in the salt wind, casting long, uncertain shadows that stretch and bend as she walks past. Here and there, a drunkard leans against a wall, murmuring to himself in a language she doesn't know, while a stray cat slips across her path, its paws silent on the slick stones. The ships in the harbor are dark, but not silent wooden hulls groan against their moorings. Ropes creak in the wind, and somewhere far out in the end, deeper water, a bell clangs once, its sound drifting in like the memory of a warning. She knows these streets well enough to walk without thinking, the route from the brothel to her rented room etched into her body's memory, past the shuttered fishmongers with their stalls scrubbed clean for the next day's catch, past the bakery whose ovens will be lit in less than an hour, the scent of yeast already ghosting the air from the dough rising somewhere within. Her boots leave small, wet prints that are quickly blurred by the mist, and the rhythm of her steps is steady, unhurried. There is no need to rush now, no one to meet, no performance to give until night falls again. At a corner where the street narrows between two tall warehouses, she pauses to adjust her shawl, glancing upward to where the dark outlines of gulls sit hunched along the roofline, their feathers ruffling in the breeze. The narrow lane here smells of tar and fish oil, and she knows if she looked closely at the walls, she'd find the faint white lines left by sailors marking the days since their arrival. Her room is on the second floor of a boarding house run by a widow who asks few questions and expects her rent in coin every Monday morning without fail. The stairwell creaks as she climbs it, her hand brushing the worn smoothness of the banister, and when she reaches her door, she pushes it open into a space that is barely larger than the bed it contains. A single window looks out over the harbor, and she sets her shawl aside, crossing to it to watch the faintest gray begin to touch the horizon. The sea looks heavier in this light, its surface broken by the masts of ships that seem to sway even when the water is calm. She sits on the edge of the bed, unfastening her boots, flexing her toes against the cool wooden floor, and counts the night's coins once more before hiding them in a tin under a loose floorboard, hiding place she changes every few weeks. Because in this city, trust is a rare and shifting thing. For a moment, she lets her mind drift, thinking not of the faces she saw tonight, but of the field outside her child home, how it looked in spring when the first green shoots broke. Through the soil, how the air smelled before rain. She knows the memory is as much a refuge as the room itself, a small, private place where the noise at the docks cannot reach. The sound of a gull's cry pulls her back to the present, and she lies down without undressing, the weight of the coins beneath the floor as much a comfort as the blanket over her. Outside, the light is growing, a pale wash across the rooftops, and the first footsteps of the morning echo faintly from the street below a fishmonger starting early, a cart being wheeled toward the market. She closes her eyes, knowing that the world will be fully awake soon, but for now, there is still a pocket of quiet in which she can rest. And in the next part, we will step away from the port to explore how prostitution in the Russian Empire was portrayed in literature and art of the time, and how these portrayals shaped public perception in ways that often bore little resemblance to the lived reality in the salons of St. Petersburg and Moscow. Far from the damp streets of the port or the cold corridors of the workhouse, prostitution often appeared not as it was lived, but as it was imagined, filtered through the pens of writers, the brushes of painters, and the gaze of an audience that preferred its truth softened or disguised. In literature, the women of the trade were frequently turned into symbols, their individuality stripped away so they could stand for ideas, temptation, moral decay, tragic redemption. Short stories in fashionable journals would feature the fallen woman archetype, young peasant girl deceived by a false promise of work, cast adrift in the city, and ultimately rescued or doomed according to the author's moral agenda. These narratives rarely pause to consider what happened in the long spaces between such plot points, the hours of work, the negotiations, the small acts of survival. In the novels of the time, a prostitute might appear as a side character whose purpose was to illuminate the failings of a male protagonist or to provide a moment of moral crisis for an otherwise respectable character, the realities of her life, ledgers, the inspections, The cold rooms were flattened into a backdrop for someone else's story. Painters, too, played their part in shaping perception. In academic art, the subject might be veiled in allegory, a dimly lit figure draped. In loose clothing, her gaze lowered, the title referring obliquely to vanity or sin. In more daring circles, artists painted brothel interiors with greater frankness. But even then, the images were staged women posed to catch the light in a way that made their work seem theatrical, exotic, or even decadent. The worn shoes, the faded wallpaper, the smell of boiled cabbage that clung to real rooms never found their way onto the canvas. Public opinion, such as it was, drew heavily from these portrayals. For those who had never walked down the streets where the trade was, practiced, the images and stories became the truth. And that truth was shaped by the distance between the observer and the observed. Respectable readers could pity the fallen without ever acknowledging the systems that profited from her fall. Gallery visitors could linger over the curve of a painted shoulder without thinking about the cold mornings and dangerous nights. That shoulder had endured. Even satire, which sometimes came closer to the truth, often relied on caricature, portraying the women as shrewd but coarse, quick-witted, but morally beyond saving a stereotype that allowed the audience to laugh, while keeping the subject firmly other. Yet now and then, a writer or artist broke through the conventions, creating a work that hinted at the complexity of the life. A handful of realist painters depicted street scenes in the poorer quarters, their women neither idealized nor demonized, but simply present leaning against a wall, speaking to one another, wrapped in shawls against the cold. Some memoirists, often those who had themselves been on the margins, wrote accounts that captured the texture of daily survival, the camaraderie between women, the strategies for avoiding dangerous clients, the small pleasures of a cup of tea. After a long night, these works were rarely celebrated in their time. They were too unvarnished, too unwilling to uphold the moral narratives that made the public comfortable. The gap between representation and reality mattered deeply because it shaped how laws were made, how charity was directed, and how stigma was enforced. A woman whose life had been turned into a tragic anecdote or a romanticized portrait could be mourned or admired at a distance, but she was unlikely to be understood, and even less likely to be defended when the empire's machinery pressed down on her. And so, the art and literature of the Russian Empire became another layer of the system, not a direct enforcer like the police or the workhouse, but a subtler influence, teaching the public how to see, and more importantly, how not to see. In the next part, we will return to the streets, this time in winter's deepest grip, to follow a night in which hunger and cold push the boundaries of what women in the trade must endure, and how they navigate the fine line between survival and surrender to the elements. The cold that night is the kind that does not simply sit on the skin, but sinks into it, tightening every muscle, numbing every fingertip, turning each breath into a small ache in the chest. The sky above the city is clear, riddled with stars, and the moon's light glances off the snow in a way that makes it look almost sharp. The streets are quieter than usual for the hour, because only those with purpose dare to stay outside in such weather. Dockhands hurrying from the tavern to the boarding house, a coachman pulling his collar high as his horse's breath fogs in the air, and the women of the trade who cannot afford to lose the night's earnings to frost. Shawls are pulled tight, skirts layered over woolen petticoats, boots lined with scraps of felt or paper for extra insulation, and still the cold finds its way in. Breath comes in steady clouds that curl upward, briefly silver in the lamplight, before dissolving into the dark. The lamps themselves burn low, their glass chimneys blurred with frost, casting weak halos onto the snow-crusted cobblestones. Tonight is not a night for loitering in doorways. Instead, the women keep moving, walking slow circuits between the places where clients might still be found, a corner near the main market square, where two taverns stand opposite each other. The alley beside the post station, the side door of a bathhouse where men sometimes emerge late with coin still in their pockets. Conversations are brief, often just an exchange of eyes and a few quiet words before the decision is made. Inside the taverns, the air is a shock of heat and noise, but it clings to the body only as long as one stays indoors. A woman might step in to warm herself while speaking to a man at the bar, then step back out into the freezing air with him, the sudden cold like a slap that wakes every nerve. Rooms are harder to come by on nights like this, as boarding houses fill with travelers unwilling to risk the roads, and so some arrangements are made in sheds, storerooms, or behind shutters hastily drawn against the wind. The risk of exposure is real, not just in the sense of being caught by a passing patrol, but in the literal danger of frostbite if the body is left too long in the open. The women know this and measure the night in the balance between what they can earn and how long they can stay outside without harm. There is a camaraderie in the cold. Two women passing each other on the street will share a quick word about where the warmer rooms are tonight, or which tavern is worth stepping into for a chance at business. Some carry small bottles of vodka, not for the clients, but for themselves, taking a careful sip now and then for the illusion of heat, though they know it is a dangerous trick that can make the cold bite deeper. Hunger adds another edge to the night. Those who have not eaten enough feel the cold more keenly, and the promise of a hot meal at the end of an arrangement can sometimes be as much a lure as the coin itself. In the darkest hours, when even the taverns begin to thin out, the streets fall into a heavy quiet. Snow muffles the sound of boots, and the only movement is the slow sweep of wind carrying stray flakes into doorways and corners. A woman waits in the shadow of a wall, her back pressed to the bricks, her hands hidden in her shawl, her eyes scanning each figure that emerges from the bathhouse across the square. When a man finally approaches, she steps forward, her voice low, offering what she has before the cold can steal the words from her mouth. They disappear together into a narrow lane, their figures swallowed by the dark. Somewhere, a clock chimes the hour, the sound carrying over the rooftops like a reminder that dawn is still far off. Those who have made enough for the night turn toward home, moving quickly, their minds fixed on the warmth of a stove and the feel of blankets drawn close. Others keep walking, circling the familiar streets, waiting for one more chance before the night gives way to morning. In the next part, we will step inside one of those small rented rooms at the end of such a night to see what it means to thaw out not just the body, but the mind after hours of braving the cold for survival. The snow was falling again by the time the city settled into its midnight hush, the kind of quiet that makes even the creak of a floorboard sound louder than it should. And in the narrow rooms where the women of the trade counted their coins, smoothed their shawls over the backs of chairs, and blew out their lamps, the day's noise thinned into private thoughts. Some slept quickly, their bodies surrendering to fatigue without ceremony. Others lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind slide along the eaves, replaying the small exchanges that had filled the night a merchant's awkward joke, the heavy silence of a soldier who never removed his gloves, the brief, startling kindness of a stranger who left more than he owed. In the brothels, ledgers would already be closed, the madam's careful handwriting locking each transaction into place. In the unlicensed quarters, the memory of the night would live only in the minds of those who walked it. Somewhere in the provinces, a woman banked her small stove with the last of her firewood, knowing it would have to last until morning. In a port city, another rose from her bed to check the harbor lights, wondering if the next tide would bring better luck. Across distances, they were linked not by friendship or even shared knowledge of one another's names, but by the invisible threads of a system that used them as both commodity and scapegoat. The empire's laws, its police, its workhouses, and even its literature had all tried to fix their identities into something simple, fallen, dangerous, redeemable. But the truth was more complex, too human to fit in the margins of a ledger or the frame of a painting. And so their lives moved on, night after night, season after season, in rooms warmed by stoves or chilled by wind through the cracks, in conversations half whispered or not spoken at all. If you could walk those streets now, feel the cold bite at your cheeks, hear the uneven rhythm of boots on snow, you might sense them still not as faded shadows, but as lives that mattered, whose survival carried a quiet defiance. History rarely lingers here, in the alleys and upstairs rooms, in the frost-bitten hands counting coins by lamplight, but if you listen closely enough, the echoes are still there, carried on the wind like a story, waiting to be heard again, heard again.